Let me just welcome everyone who's tuning in today to our Spring Weir Conversation for Equity. We're excited to bring folks together from across our coalition for today's conversation. I'm Sherline. I'm the Executive Director of Washington Employers for Racial Equity, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about center us around our principles and why we're here and sort of frame the conversation. The coalition, Weir, was formed in 2020, centered around 7 key commitments to progress that private employers believe they can impact and influence to close equity gaps in their workforces. The commitment to goals for 2030 state that member organizations will actively pursue fostering inclusive workplace cultures, employ workplaces that reflect the communities they operate in, achieve racial pay parity, increase Black individual representation in management and senior leadership positions, increase internships and work-embedded learning experiences for Black students, increase supplier diversity and investments in Black-owned businesses, and increase advancing racial equity in workplaces and within communities.
In this session, we are choosing to discuss and clarify what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and how it relates to the moment we are in as we work to progress equity for people who are marginalized. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are the descriptors used in organizations to identify processes, strategies, and actions management may take in the interest in cultivating a varied workforce. DEI done well means that the work of inclusion and equity applies to all groups who are often marginalized. This could be by racial group, and it could also be by gender, sexual orientation, ability, or neurodivergence in any number of states protected by EEOC laws. So let's unpack diversity, equity, and inclusion a little more. DEI means awareness of how we communicate with one another across cultures that support equal treatment and opportunities. DEI can help us learn the skills of cultivating inclusion in work teams and workplace settings. DEI can also help us understand the systems that work against inclusion and belonging that contribute to disproportionately negative outcomes for people who've been historically marginalized. DEI practices give us a language to engage in the challenging, sometimes uncomfortable conversations and change actions needed to root out unfair legacy practices and that make the future more equal. And finally, diversity, equity, and inclusion practices are necessary in order to disrupt static systems and processes needed to innovate and remain competitive in a diversifying world.
So Weir Coalition members believe that all Washingtonians should have the same opportunities, free of the barriers of racism. We believe that the private sector has a vital role to play in creating that lasting change that contributes to making Washington a place known for vitality, inclusion, and a globally competitive economic future. I am so excited to bring our spring guest speaker from the University of St. Thomas, Dr. Yohuru Williams. Dr. Williams is a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. He received his PhD from Howard University in 1998. Dr. Williams is the author and editor of several books, including Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement. They call him Jack, the story of Jackie Robinson, one of my personal favorite individuals, and Black Freedom Fighter, and More Than a Dream, the Radical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. Williams has appeared on a variety of local and national television and radio programs. His scholarly articles have also appeared in the American Bar Association's Insights on Law and Society and the Journal for Civil and Human Rights. Dr. Williams, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. What I wanted to do, since we have such a short time together and such an opportunity for an intimate conversation is just give kind of a broad overview of where I think we are now and share a few slides. And talk about the kind of unique but not so unique position that we find ourselves in this moment, particularly when there's so much conversation nationally about the pushback against the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I want to do just very briefly is talk about overcoming, or what history can teach us about overcoming racism. And I love this political cartoon, Shoreline, because it speaks to another moment when there was tremendous hope about the ability to overcome barriers to equity and inclusiveness. Another moment when there was hope that we might make real progress in terms of dismantling systemic racism, and that was the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. I love this cartoon because it depicts Richard Nixon, 1969, confronting a young African-American girl, and she's carrying a briefcase that reads 15 years since the Supreme Court decision. Of course, that was Brown versus Board of Education, and mocks the court's dictate in that decision that schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed, with the president of the United States himself standing in front of a James Crow School, holding a picket sign. And this encapsulates in that moment what some people term the backlash against civil rights. This conversation that was happening about fear that was expressed widely among whites in that moment about the pace of civil rights being too quick, too swift, and what that would ultimately mean for the nation as a whole. And so this cartoon kind of encapsulates that in a way that's very interesting, because I think part of the problem here, at least in the way that we talk about our history, and certainly in the way that we equity, is that part of the challenge for Americans is what Americans always want is a tragedy with a happy ending. We have a sitcom understanding of our history. We want everything wrapped up in 30 minutes or less, 24 minutes with commercials, and that interrupts the work necessary to do the heavy lift that will be required really to make progress in dismantling systemic racism. I take that concept of a tragedy with a happy ending from an NPR program I watched, or listened to, excuse me, about 15 years ago, where the host was talking about the differences between Russian literature and American literature. And he said, whereas the Russians love these long tomes like War and Peace, where the hero is poorly rewarded at the end, Americans always want this kind of fairy tale that interrupts our ability to be in the work for the long haul. I share that because, and I love to quote James Baldwin, really the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. And the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is altering the way that people look at and think about equity work, think about the work long term and its impact, the return on investment for the hard work of dismantling systemic racism and structures that continue to promote inequality in our society as a whole. And I think it's also important, and I love sharing this, that sometimes people will make this partisan, or they'll talk about this as in terms of being part of a liberal or a woke agenda. I always love to quote Sandra Day O'Connor, who in 2017 in Time magazine talked about democracy as a practice. And I love this because she said, the practice of democracy is not transferred through the gene pool. It must be taught and learned anew by each generation of citizens. I would argue that the two things that are powerful about this is that Sandra Day O'Connor is making the case for education, teaching, as opposed to training. And a lot of times when we talk about diversity, education, and inclusion, you hear people talk about trainings. The work that I do, the work of historical recovery, is really around education. We educate humans, we train pets, we train animals. And so training actually reinforces some of the problematic thinking we associate with implicit bias. Those reactions that we make that are really on autopilot, the things that our brain automatically does that often get us into trouble because they resort to this kind of lazy thinking as opposed to active processing about how to create equitable structures or to make real change in those environments where we have influence. I also love this because I'm someone who's had 3 heart procedures in the last 5 years. And so I love that Sandra Day O'Connor talks about the practice of democracy. I love to tell my first year law students, law is a practice. and medicine as a practice, because if it wasn't, I would have only had one heart procedure in the last 5 years. And I like that only because it emphasizes that this is something that we have to work at every day. We don't achieve the work of overcoming racism. We do the work. We practice it every day and every moment, and every facet of the way that we think about a host of issues that impact communities of color, but the larger society as well. So having said that, I want to focus on why I spend so much time talking about historical recovery in my work. And I want to do that, I think, in a way that's interesting, by sharing a story shared by Ella Baker, the mother of the civil rights movement. And Ella Baker, in 1969, was talking to a group, and she was talking about her work, and she said, I used to go around making speeches, and I would open up my talk by saying there was a man who had a health problem, and he was finally told by the doctor that could save his sight or save his memory, but they couldn't save both. They asked which did he want. He said, save my sight because I'd rather see where I am going than remember where I've been. Ella Baker responded to that. But I'm saying, as you must say too, that in order to see where we're going, we must understand where we've been. So that history becomes very important. This calls for a great deal of analytical thinking and evaluation of methods that have been used. I love to tell the organizations that I work with that history doesn't repeat itself, it echoes. And those echoes are indictments when we look back and realize that we've confronted these issues before, we've come up with similar solutions, and often the obstacles that derail the work are frighteningly familiar. And I'll give an example of that in just a second. But to conclude, Ella Baker says, we have to begin to think in terms of where do we really want to go and how can we get there. In terms of that concept of history echoing, part of this is rooted in this historical amnesia that then winds up in things like Martin Luther King's birthday being the occasion for sales, when Dr. King spent so much time talking about equity and justice and fair wages and so on and so forth. And so that's one example or one manifestation of that historical amnesia. But the other is this, and it is this reduction of the civil rights movement to these kind of simplistic and problematic condensations of the thinking of people like Dr. Martin Luther King or an Ella Baker or Pauli Murray or a host of other people who are making the case that at the core, civil rights was always about inclusivity, but in very, very broad terms, including elements of economic justice, which make people uncomfortable. I want to be very clear what I mean by that, because Isabel Wilkerson talks about this in her book, Caste, and it connects in powerful ways to what you see in these two cartoons. This pushback now nationally against the teaching of African-American history. You see that in terms of this cartoon on the left. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of oversimplification of the ideas of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And what happens when we don't teach our history honestly and all of its complexity, when we don't confront the ugly warts that we associate with our history, when we take the thinking of Dr. King and the I Have a Dream speech and reduce it to a meme, we end up doing exactly what Isabel Wilkerson suggests in Caste. And she writes about it in this way. She says, America is an old house. We can never declare the work over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. I love that because we often talk about slavery as America's original sin. Well, baked into this great and hopeful enterprise of American democracy is this contradiction, which Edmund Morgan talks about as the contradiction between American slavery and American freedom. We often don't frame it in this way, but one of the reasons that Jefferson is able to wax so eloquently about the meaning of freedom is every day he could look out the back door of his plantation and see what unfreedom looked like. So there's this dependent relationship that we have to understand that influences the way that we think about the American experience. Wilkerson goes one step further. She says, when you live in an old house, you may not want to go down into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have brought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you're ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection. from the consequences of inaction. Whatever you were wishing will go away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face it and to actually see it, to face what you would rather not see. I spent a few minutes talking about Wilkerson because when we read that or when we think about that, it really, in a way, animates our contemporary moment. And I want to share this report from April 26th, this article that came out in the Star Tribune, April 26th. Needed are more diversity trainings. That's today, obviously, April 26th, Friday, April 20th. Needed are more diversity trainings, better communication, and perhaps policy changes. The company's growth depends on creativity of 3M employees, increasing numbers of whom will be people of color. Its creative environment must draw strength from diversity. It's a future like that. If its future like that of Minneapolis may be at stake. So it's talking about Minnesota. The problem, my friends, is that this is April 26th, but it's April 26th, 1993. In the aftermath of another moment, another one of these turning points in U.S. history, and that was the verdict in the case of the officers that beat motorist Rodney King. And in that moment, we were having very similar conversations to the conversations that came in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. In fact, I want to read a little bit more from this article from 1993, April 26, 1993, that helps to make my point about how not understanding that history, not going into the basement, not confronting it in a meaningful way, looking for that tragedy with a happy ending becomes an indictment. This is what they wrote in 1993. Minneapolis must work harder to become racism-free. The 1993 version of anti-racism. The alternative is the perpetuation of disparity and injustice. The alternative also may consist of a poor economy, an underutilized workforce, more poverty-related crime, wasted financial resources, adverse environmental impact, and increased hopelessness and violence. In other words, Greater Minneapolis could become more like problem-plagued urban areas elsewhere. The warning has been given before, but deserves to be heard again. Again, that's 1993. I would suggest Shoreline and I could write this up tomorrow and publish this in the New York Times, and people would argue that we had our fingers on the pulse of the nation in this moment, when in fact, all we would be doing is talking about the historical echoes. And again, this is damning as an indictment, but it also invites us to think about what went wrong in that moment and why do we continue to find ourselves in this loop in terms of taking on these issues. I also want to mention in relation to this, that in that moment, there was also a conversation about the backlash against anti-racism in that moment, which in that moment, rather than anti-racism, we called multiculturalism. So instead of BIPOC, the byword of that moment was multiculturalism. There's always one, and we can put our finger on it. But I also want to be clear that in that moment, in 1993, people were very conscious of this being a response to the beating of Rodney King. And I think Dr. King speaks to that in a way that I want to share with you today, because I also want to play with these historical echoes by going back to St. Paul, Minnesota, Dr. King speaking on April 27th, 1967. So we're in the same. This is what Dr. King said. I think you'll find this interesting. I'm going to play about a minute of this.
The victories did very little to penetrate the lower depths of Negro deprivation. And so this is where we are today, moving to a new phase of the struggle. And it is a much more difficult phase. Over the last 12 years, we were working mainly to end legal segregation. We were working mainly to establish decency. Many people rose up with glowing commitment and supported us all over the nation as we sought to do this. I'm convinced that the vast majority of people who supported us in Alabama or Mississippi were really more opposed to Bull Connor or to the extremist behavior of a Jim Clark in Selma than they were for genuine equality and justice.
I wanted to share that with you because I think if we alter Dr. King's words just a little bit, I would argue that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, it appears in this moment as in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision in Fair versus Howard, as in the wake of efforts by governors and legislatures across the country to end or interrupt or hamper the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that more people were, as Dr. King put it, talking about in that moment, Bull Connor, who sicked the dogs and put the fire hoses on those young people in Birmingham. More people were disturbed by and interested in addressing the issue of Derek Chauvin and the violence visited on George Floyd's body than they were committed to the long-term work of dismantling structures of inequality in our broader society and our community and our corporate environments. And that's the rub that we find ourselves in our contemporary moment, why this backlash is gaining such momentum and why so many people are looking for the exit ramp without naming that they're looking for the exit ramp and saying, well, it's the Supreme Court's decision, or we can't continue to do this work, or that this is always, and this is a continuation of that echo that I talked about a few minutes ago. It also brings us to confront something that you see consistently in African-American literature and Black literature, and themes in Black history. Lorraine Hansberry named it in her play, A Raisin in the Sun, where she has Asagi say to one of the main characters, Benita, then isn't there something wrong in a house, in a world where all dreams, good or bad, must depend on the death of a man? We find ourselves in a moment again, and I'm saying this to you as there's been another brutal killing of an African-American suspect by police in Canton, Ohio, that here we go again. What are we waiting for? The next George Floyd moment, for the next Rodney King moment, for the next? That's not sustainable, and yet that's been our model in terms of tackling these issues. Issues that have real consequences and that produce real harm for communities of color, that become matters of, political gesturing, but in fact, as you look at this political cartoon, are impacting communities in ways that are deeply tangible. I focus primarily on the African-American history, African-American experience today with the purpose, but I could also talk about this in terms of Indigenous people, Native Americans, which of course Washingtonians understand to be as equally pressing and as equally powerful when we think about these echoes. A group of people who have been dealing with these disparities, these inequalities, who are suffering from them in ways that slogan like I Can't Breathe captures it, not just for criminal justice, but for healthcare, for housing, for education, and those who can't see or find opportunities to kind of return to this ignorance, right? Not going into the basement or saying we can't confront those things. And that's a big part of the problem. Just want to continue for another 3 minutes talking about that 1993 article. And ironically, when I say history echoes, in that moment, the global concern was over Bosnia. And I just point to you this political cartoon that was published in adjacent to the article on diversity, equity, and inclusion. No, but if you wait 40 years, we'll build you a nice Holocaust museum where we can all feel guilty for not doing something at the time. And then in the article that I was sharing with you earlier on diversity, what's new is a report from the Minneapolis Initiative Against Racism, an effort begun last year in city government, but now involving more than 300 people. The report is available from the Minneapolis Planning Department. It outlines several dozen possible action steps involving economic development efforts, the media, city and county government, human service agencies, schools, churches, and more. Particularly timely given recent suggestions for a residency requirement for new city employees is a proposal to offer police low interest or no interest loans as an incentive to move into high crime neighborhoods. Anyway, one more here. Such things, the report says, constitute a pattern. People of color are systemically denied the quality of life promised to all citizens. The Urban Coalition for Public Policy was formed in the 1960s. More recently, top business executives signed an open letter to residents in 1989. This is mirrors what happened in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. In 1990, the Anti-Defamation League, Jewish Community Relations Council organized the education and media campaign called The World of Difference. The Minneapolis Foundation held retreats for community leaders and joined the Urban Coalition. And what came of all that? Why did all of that fail? Why did it fall apart? I want to read one last part of this report to you. On the same day that the Minneapolis Initiative Against Racism held a community meeting on its report, a news story described how 3M survey found a wide difference between white and minority perceptions of how minority workers are treated. So it wasn't just external. It was what was happening within corporations at that time, dealing with and addressing a lot of the issues that mirror what we're seeing in corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts today. Interestingly, they note here, most white workers thought that minorities were treated fairly. A majority of Blacks disagreed. A third of women employees cited sexual harassment as a problem. The survey was a wake-up call that other companies might hear as well if they subjected themselves to the same critical look. If they went into the basement, if they were honest about the work to be done and weren't looking for that tragedy with a happy ending, that quick fix. I'm going to conclude with 3 slides here, the penultimate paragraph of this piece. People are tired of reports that don't seem to produce change, was the response from community. Fortunately, corporate and foundation financial support will continue, they argued in that moment. But that idea that people are tired of reports that don't produce change always comes up against the backlash. And if we were talking about the 1950s and 1960s, that's the word that you saw, the backlash to civil rights. Nina Simone sang about it in a song called Mississippi Goddamn and Mr. Backlash, which was the lyrics adapted from a Langston Hughes poem about this pushback by whites being made uncomfortable by efforts to make the society live up to the aspirational language of its founders and to the democratic principles that animate the way that we think about not only American democracy, but corporate fairness and ethical practice and so on and so forth. Today, that's being framed as, or critical race theory and calling this wokeism and so on and so forth, but it's just the backlash. And if you don't believe me, I just want to share with you very quickly that, again, not only is this not new, I love sharing this with Minnesota audiences. If anti-racism is something new, then explain Hubert Humphrey's Pledge for American Unity from 1948, which contains many of the tenets that we would associate with anti-racism today. But more importantly, put that up against Dr. King talking about the backlash, again, St. Paul, Minnesota, April 27th, 1967. I'm going to play this for you quickly, and then Charlene and I are going to be involved in conversation, but I think you'll find this interesting. So for those of you that are practitioners or involved in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Dr. King is speaking directly to you and kind of helping all of us understand that what we face in this moment in terms of the pushback against the work is not new. It has historical roots. And if I had more time with you today, I could go to other moments like this that would illustrate this point, but Dr. King will do a good job of encapsulating that for us in this short piece.
The problem is that we see backlashing all along in civil rights legislation. States will pass laws and do nothing to implement them or enforce them or put teeth in them. The need is for legislation strongly enforced. Now we have a civil rights bill again before Congress. One aspect of it deals with maladministration of justice. Now everybody knows that we need this. In the state of Mississippi alone, since 1963, some 48 Negroes and white civil rights workers have been brutally murdered, and not a single person has been convicted for these dastardly crimes. And there are still areas where the murder of Negroes and white persons of goodwill is a popular pastime. And there's need for federal legislation to rectify the jury systems and to make these kinds of crimes federal and go all out to make for adequate and proper administration of justice. Now, the other aspect of this legislation.
Now, King winds up talking about criminal justice there, but I'm hoping that everyone picked up on that first part where he's talking about this pushback, this backlash, so on and so forth, which is critical, at least in terms of understanding the work that we do and why at this point, more than at any point in the struggle, we have to dig deep. Like, this isn't a moment for retreat. This isn't a moment for watering down. This is a moment for kind of looking at these historical echoes to really then think about how we reimagine the work, not to find ourselves in that familiar echo. And again, I don't like repeat. History doesn't repeat itself, it echoes. Slightly different, but the echoes are indictments. Dr. King talked about this in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, when he said, first, the line of progress is never straight. For a period, a movement may follow a straight line, then it encounters obstacles and the path bends. It's like a curving around the mountain when you're approaching a city. Often it feels as though you're moving backwards and you lose sight of your goal, but in fact, you're moving ahead, and soon you will see the city again closer by. In previous echoes, when those obstacles presented themselves, people took that mountain to be immovable and the work stopped. And in this moment in particular, we can't allow that to be the model. We have to continue to push forward. We have to understand that the progress that we've made in this work to this point has not been easy, but it's certainly not in vain. And using that history as a way of thinking concretely about how we move forward, we have to understand that the backlash is normal. We can't allow that to disrupt the work. That really in this moment, the backlash is a clear indication that we're winning, that we're succeeding. Otherwise, there'd be no backlash. This is what we can learn from history. One of the things that we can take away is that that's a good indication that we must be doing something right. We must be working to dismantle those systems. Otherwise, no one would care what we were digging up from our flooded basement. So that's what I wanted to share with you in general, and I'm excited to be in conversation with Sherline about some of the broader issues in our contemporary moment.
Wow, I was feverishly taking notes. I felt like I was just like back to school. So, wow. I think my kind of three takeaways from what I heard you talk about is, that the backlash is not new, right? There's evidence through the arc of history that there's these moments of like inflection and reflection, and then there's action, but there's always the just as much as there are echoes of these injustices, there are echoes of backlash in previous attempts. So that's not new. The work is still critical and central for economic and moral and other imperatives, right? It resonates to me so fiercely that all of these luminaries who came before us, who were pointing at this and shining the light on this, that it's never more critical for us to understand and get the message and take action on that. And of course, we have to continue to invest in ourselves and each other and being able to see. We must be able to see. And that is something that I think we struggle with. People sort of go into what you talked about this sort of amnesia moment, and people want to act like watching a man get murdered on a camera is something new. It's not new, right? And we need to be able to see that and connect the dots across systems. So very, very, very powerful.
A big part of your work, Sherline, and something I appreciated about our conversation yesterday, and even as you are kind of articulating that, I think, and I'd love your perspective on this as you've encountered it, these efforts to kind of create different language for the same phenomena in our contemporary moment. So it's like it's the same thing, it's just a different frame for the pushback.
Yes, sir. And, and that was why I sort of asking, I'll bring up the question we asked last night at dinner, and that was, okay, so is right now different? Is there a way to actually effectively advance this work and progress this without naming what it is that we're doing here and who it is that we're doing this for? And I just thought it was really fascinating how everyone around the table from different lived experiences and exposure to this, we all unanimously agreed. So would you mind recapping for the benefit of the group, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I thought it was such a great question. And I agree with you. It was kind of interesting that we got similar responses from everyone who was at the table. Vice President for Human Resources and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion officers. And then people who are involved in this work organically in various ways, that we can't be lukewarm in the work. We have to name it. And that means making people uncomfortable in ways that hasn't been productive, or some people don't see as productive, because they want comfort in this. They deeply desire that tragedy with the happy ending. They want to feel like we did something, we checked the box, we did our implicit bias training, let's move on. We got this piece of legislation passed, or this person elected, or we hired for this office, and the work exists there and is not shared throughout the organization or throughout the community or throughout the nation, whatever it may be. And that's always been the downfall in this work, because people see it as kind of being segmented and not shared across an organization. It isn't deeply embedded or framed as part of mission or critical to the identity of the organization. And then I think the other part of it is, and we talked a lot about this last night, that desire not to make people uncomfortable, to really kind of frame this work in ways that the parties that need to be named, right, don't want the discomfort of hearing certain concepts that they feel challenge their goodness, often end up putting us in a position where we can't make real progress, that they want to kind of embrace the work at a distance. And embrace means checking the box, or and I love this one too, because we saw it in Minnesota, the aftermath of the conviction of Derek Chauvin, the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey. He's a great person, a very good person, came out and said, this murder trial has animated our community for the last 11 months, and the jury didn't look away, and we convicted the bad guy. And so now, and 2 weeks later, they cleared George Floyd Square. And I was like, this is a mistake. Like, this is the problem. We don't need to clear the square. We need to focus on the other challenges, inequalities, disparities that the George Floyd murder exposed. It wasn't just about the killing of George Floyd. It was about all the other things that came together, I think, Shoreline, and one witness who got overlooked in that entire trial. And that was the young girl who worked at the service station across from George Floyd. Here's a girl who dropped out of school in the 11th grade, who was doing irregular work at the service station across from the Cup Food. And in her testimony, she goes, in addition to all the problems that people at 38th in Chicago were dealing with it, she said the worst of it is when the police come, and I'm quoting her, she says, try not to curse, messing with people, end quote. Well, she was indicating that there are other things that were happening there, including the fact that at Cup Food, a box of cereal costs 3 times what it would cost in the suburbs. At Cup Food, there isn't healthy food that are available to the people that live in that community. At Cup Food, the police see the people that they are there to serve and protect as the enemy. And so the beating of George Floyd is kind of the least of what we need to focus on. And yet, in that corporate response, often what we find people saying is, we issued our statement on that. And so we've done our good deed, and now we get to push back from the table, and that's somebody else's problem, when in fact it's shared across the board. Those better decisions that'll be made about policy, about access, about how we think about a host of issues that help to contribute to the tragedy of 38th in Chicago are solved in corporate structures, in boardrooms, in individuals who are in the C-suite. And so corporations don't get to walk away from that work. They really have to be part of the process of reimagining.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so I just wonder about, when we have sort of time-bound equity commitments, such as those in WEIR, right? Is it possible to, what are we missing with this? I mean, we're like, okay, for 10 years, we're actually really going to be very intentional about learning to see, about interrupting those systems, about setting forth the process of improving policies to the benefit of, those inclusion goals. What do you think organizations like the companies who've made these commitments should be thinking about? And are we missing anything from your perspective?
We're missing a lot. And I do not, I've been pretty adamant about this. The time bound is a mistake. It's a huge mistake. Just from a historical standpoint, it took us 400 years to find ourselves in this position. So the idea that we could dismantle this in 10 years is ambitious at best. And 10 years is actually better than what I've seen in some places where they're like, this is our 3-year commitment or our 5-year commitment to tackling disparities. And then again, looking for the exit ramp along that process and not understanding that these are deeply embedded policies, practices, and procedures that continue to echo and reverberate in ways that simple remedial steps won't address. Do one very quickly. The wealth gap is deep because of redlining and residential segregation patterns and segregation in schools. You're not going to undo that in 10 years. You're not going to undo that through a process of promotion within a corporate structure. Those things help, and they certainly shouldn't be avoided, but putting a 10-year stamp on that actually hurts the work, because really what it becomes is a search for a hunt for false metrics, right? So then how do we evaluate progress, and then how do we think about that in a very limited context of the ticking clock as opposed to the long-term change that we want to see in community? For me, if you're going to make an investment, for example, in K-12 education, you're talking about a 30-year, not a 10-year. If you're going to talk about an investment in structures and community, in terms of addressing housing or health disparities, you're talking about a 50-year, not a 10-year. You're talking about a generation. And that type of approach, I think, is much more productive in what we haven't seen yet. We've often seen historically these time-limited, time-bound, we're going to do this in 3 years. That's great in terms of rolling out a new line. That's not going to undo, in some cases, what you're talking about. Even if we just go back to Plessy versus Ferguson, it's not going to undo more than a century of economic disparity and racial injustice, which we can name. Loved working with my partners over at Delta Dental. We're talking about healthcare disparities. Shared yesterday the Hospital Construction Act of 1946, which created, was supposed to place hospitals in areas of high need. It placed those hospitals in predominantly white areas, reified Jim Crow. And so the health outcomes that we see in communities of color today are a direct result not only of that policy, but an earlier report, 1910, the Flexner report, where there were only 7 medical schools that educated Black and brown people, Black doctors. They closed 5 of those 7 schools and only left 2. So when we talk about a shortage in doctors today, of doctors of color, African-American doctors in particular, the reverberations, the echoes of those policies and practices and procedures continue to reverberate. 10 years, not going to solve that. You're talking about a 50-year, a 100-year commitment, and then people really making a deep investment by saying, we're not just going to talk about this, we're going to rethink and rewrite our mission statement so that this is specific to who we are and our identity. We're going to rethink our community partnerships so that what we're saying as a community is we're going to take on this collective lift, and our metrics won't be in these 3-4 year increments. They'll be long-term. What does our workforce look like in 20 years? We don't get that cartoon that I showed in the very beginning of the young girl with the 15 years since Brown versus Board of Education, and people are still litigating whether it was a good decision or not. We made the decision, we embedded in our mission statement, our identity. Now the question is, how do we get there?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I respect and appreciate, as someone who has a background in kind of change management and project management and in those ways, and that it feels sort of like a natural thing to say, okay, we're going to start with some kind of time frame. But as you really start to interrogate what actually needs to be transformed and changed, you do get to a place of saying, okay, there isn't a done, right? But there are things that we can do to build systems in place to open our eyes to see and to be able to spot these things and to use our collective emotional and cognitive muscles to actually start to dismantle some of those systems. And also being able to recognize that some of the things that we're facing today are essentially consequences of not using those muscles, right? Of not being willing to see, of in some cases seeing, but ignoring on purpose the things that we are able to see. So I value your very candid response to my question. So, we talked a lot to CEOs about how they as leaders define company cultures. I mean, that's sort of the essence of how we got started. We were talking to CEOs about how can you affect change? What can you do? And when do you want to do it by? And how do we want to measure it, right? And so big component of the coalition is around periodically spot checking and doing progress reports and being a mirror and reflecting back that progress that organizations have made. We ask our CEOs to make unapologetic commitments to protect and to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some specific demonstrations that you, from your perspective, are seeing as you are moving about the country that show you that there's authentic work that's happening there, that there's progress that's being made? What gives you hope?
It's such a great question, Shoreline. And I think the first thing is what I'm seeing here with a partner like Delta Dental of Washington, where 4 years later, they're still doing the work. And they're doing the work around education. So they're educating their employee base about disparities and thinking about that in relationship to mission. So it's true also of my partner, Delta Dental of Minnesota, where their mantra is healthy smiles make healthy communities. But if there anyone in our community who doesn't have access to oral health care, then that's contributing to a lack of the thing that we've committed ourselves to. I love that. So it's so deeply embedded in terms of who they are. And it's also very true of the work here. That's continuing in education. So it's not, we gave money to scholarships for this is who we are and this is how we think about what's happening in community, and that's the work that we do. So I love that. I love and have worked with a couple of corporations that have said, and this is something that I was a big proponent of, instead of trying to, and I've heard this language used, CEOs who have shared, I feel like trying to tackle racism is like trying to boil the ocean. I'm not asking you to boil the ocean. What I'm asking you to think about is, what is your primary business? Because racial disparity is death by 1,000 cuts. So I worked with a organization that's involved in solid waste management. And they were saying, CEO said, look, I gave $5 million to Minneapolis public schools and the test scores didn't go up. And so I feel like that investment was a failure. And I said, wait a minute, you're in solid waste management. So I want to be clear. If you want to be in this work long term, that work has to be measurable. I respect that. Sustainable, authentic to who you are, and give you the opportunity and your successors not to walk away. There are a host of disparity issues that are directly related to hygiene, clean water. So make your investment there, because you may not think about it in this way, but I gave him an example from the civil rights movement. Pest control, huge civil rights issue during the 1950s and 1960s, huge. And in Washington, D.C., Marion Barry partly gets elected on saying that he's going to deal with the rat problem in Southeast DC. As a civil rights organizer, he understood that was kind of a bread and butter issue for people in that community, but it was actually a real health concern for people who are living in Southeast Washington, DC. And that helped to elevate him to power, not from the standpoint of politics, but I thought, what if he had a partner who said, we can't do it all, but one of the ways that we know that we can do this is we're going to offer low cost, or we're going to do training or education or investment in this particular area. And our metric is going to be, we're going to hang our hat on, this is the way that we tackle disparity. It's authentic to who we are. It's sustainable. It doesn't require us to stretch. Now, again, I encourage you do more than that. But when I think about this in terms of if you could get a partnership of corporate bodies that were thinking in ways that they could all contribute in a sustainable and meaningful way to tackling issue of disparity, that's meaningful. And we've got a couple of partners who've said, we see the sensibility of that. And the other thing that I've mentioned a couple of times today, I think is very important, is you got to rewrite your mission statement. To me, that's the biggest indicator of how committed you are. If that then finds its way in a meaningful way, and one of the corporate entities that I work with, but they were already doing this work that I love, Best Buy. It's exactly what Corey Berry has done. So we've rewritten our mission statement. So this is who we are. If we deviate from this, then it means that we're not fulfilling our mission. I love that, because then what it does is it reduces this pushback that you get where people go, well, this is a woke agenda. No, Best Buy saying, diversity is a strength. We need to build diverse talent pool. We need to build pipelines. We want to encourage and be able to appeal to diverse audiences. We recognize that as a strength. And so we're embedding that in a way that we can't run away from it. And our board can't run away from it. And anything that's happening external to us doesn't get to dictate that, we're going to move away from that. I'm not saying that organizations like that don't have challenges, but at least it makes it something that embeds it in a way that's much more firm. So I'm a big fan of those types of models and approaches. Those folks that are creative in this moment, because we really all, if we're being honest, have to be very creative in the way that we do this work. The pushback is real. And that sunsetting that you and I talked about, for a lot of organizations, the time is, the clock's running out. And so kind of reimagining the work becomes critical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and what's interesting to me, this will be my last question I'll ask you, and then I will just give folks, if they want to drop questions in the chat, please do so at this time, and I'll feed those up to Dr. Williams before we get to the bottom of the hour. There's the level of the organization that's our CEOs, and they're making these commitments, and they're doing the work to adjust their mission statements. They're really being sort of very, very front and center and vocal about being somewhat unapologetic about their commitments to do this work. And by and large, the majority of our signatories are so there and consistent with that commitment. And I'm excited about that. Where I think sometimes there's a little bit of a struggle is at the implementation level. And so I hear executive leaders below the CEO level bring up all the time about how they are feeling resistance, either coming from their workforces or perhaps coming from other, external stakeholders. And this is a very confusing and difficult time for them. What say you about that implementation level in the organization? How do we move from CEO vision to the execution and implementation within organizations?
It's a great question. Again, I think it has to be something where that education has to extend down from the CEO and the board to the managers. And so a manager level ongoing education and opportunity to kind of rethink mission, owning that at that next level down. So implementation strategies that move beyond what the entity says and how each part of the organization is going to live that mission, right? Authentic. In the same way that we ask CEOs to be authentic in terms of the mission of the whole, that each part has to think about, if I'm in IT, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's not our, what do we have to do with that? And we're going to watch this little thing called Coded Bias. And we're going to spend some time talking about how you could rethink and reimagine your work to be work that meets the goals of creating a diverse and equitable workforce and being more responsive to community and understanding the ways in which tech. So there are ways to do that where you're kind of moving down to that next level and inviting that shared appreciation and understanding of the work that then moves it out of the realm of, and I think this is important too, when you get that, and it happens a lot, like I hear this a lot, well, our folks don't understand. They're watching what's happening in other places and they're saying, what does this have to do with business? What does this have to do with who we are and what we do? That's where those managers actually can be very strong advocates in kind of being educators and drivers of that work, but through the shared understanding and through this lens of, this is an equity work. This is the work. We have to stop labeling it in a way that now, again, that's not saying we shouldn't name it. It just says that you name it along with kind of investing people in this idea that the work, in terms of how they're framing it, has to be addressed in that way. I'll give you one last example of this that surely one of my favorite stories is from Stephen King, the horror writer. And he wrote this great piece in the 1980s called Why We Crave Horror Films. And he said that if an American horror film, when horror films work, they work on multiple levels. So when you're 7, what scares the hell out of you is that there's a monster in the closet and you tell your parents there's a monster in the closet and they don't believe you. And they send you to bed and the monster's in the closet going, we're going to have a great time tonight because your parents don't believe you. But Stephen King said he was watching the Amityville horror movie, and when he realized it was going to be a hit, he was sitting behind this young couple. And as the green stuff was oozing out of the plumbing, the wife turned to the husband and said, "Oh my God, the bills." So when you're 34, what scares the hell out of you is you've invested your life savings in a home. And now the plumbing's not working, the home seems to be eating your money, and the worst of it is that your child won't go to sleep and you feel like the whole thing is imploding. That shared responsibility means no one bears the responsibility of the totality of that work alone. That everybody within that house, within that structure, is making sure that it feels less like a horror movie and more like a reclamation project that everyone has a stake in. And that could be something as simple as putting that light on in the kids' room, or thinking about differently about how you invested your resources to begin with, and tackling the other problems that present themselves in the basement.
Excellent. Wow. I mean, such a powerful example and metaphor of really around this is whole housework, and everybody in the house has a stake in the maintenance and improvement effort. And it's one of the things that I also talk about with folks. I'm like, this is everybody's work. This is all of our work, right? So wow, that's really powerful. You know, I love that you started this conversation. I'm just going to backtrack a tiny bit. And last night at dinner, you told this really powerful story about you and your wife in a car, in a rental car, on your way to an engagement, and you were pulled over. Would you mind retelling that story?
Sure. Last summer, my alma mater was recognizing me as a distinguished alum. And my wife and I picked up our car from LaGuardia and we're driving out to Scranton, Pennsylvania to receive that award. And I was pulled over by a New Jersey state trooper who then proceeded. I was going, I joked last night, I'm the poster child for the safe driver. So I was going below the speed limit and, got behind me. My wife was on a Zoom and I said to her, he's going to pull us over. And indeed he did. And from the moment that he approached my vehicle, it was an exchange where he was anticipating that he was dealing with me in a way that denied my humanity. No honorifics in addressing me. He asked me, where was I going? Did I know why he stopped me? Where was I going? I said, well, I'm going to get this Distinguished Alum Award. Where are you coming from? Where's your luggage? Who's she? Is how he addressed my wife, who was my passenger. And fortunately, she videotaped all this. So I had all this on tape. And Diverse Issues in Higher Education actually did a write-up on it because I shared the video with them and kind of my experience. But my point in kind of bringing that up last night and kind of sharing that with people more broadly is it makes two parallel points that I think it's difficult sometimes for the audiences that we speak to in the DE&I work to understand. That this is real for us in a way that it seems like an exercise in kind of intellectualism or something for other people. We live this experience. And so my safety and my sanity depend on my ability to navigate spaces where there's hostility. And I understood that encounter could have gone very wrong if I behaved differently in the way that I was interacting with that trooper. I also understand that that's the legacy in the New Jersey State Police that goes back decades. Christy Todd Whitman was governor in the 1990s, and they were talking about racial profiling on the Jersey Turnpike. So this is an old story, an old wound that I'm still living the echoes of. And then also, importantly, because, we think about this in terms of just encounters with police, but also the ways in which individuals, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, don't appreciate that the training remains the same, the protocols, the very way that we think about law enforcement as opposed to public safety, which are two very different conversations. Folks, I think in healthcare understand this, but when we talk about law enforcement, then we look at an entity like the Minneapolis Police. They're formed in 1867. I sometimes have to remind audiences in Minnesota that the raison d'etre, that it's in their charter. The Minneapolis Police were about policing Black and brown bodies. It was about determining where people of color could be. I mean, that's it. Commissioners of public safety in the South. We think about someone like a Eugene Bull Connor that Martin Luther King mentioned. Commissioner of public safety was all about enforcing segregation. But in our contemporary moment, if we move to a model of public safety, what are the police out there to do? prevent crime or make sure that drivers get to their destination safely. And that would change the way that they engage public and so on and so forth. So it was just one of those moments where, as someone who does this work, became this powerful way that I could share it, but then also share, I was angry. And I couldn't express my full humanity in that moment for fear that if I express myself in a particular way, I'm simply, and that was the story of Sandra Bland and so many other people of color who are good, earnest, hardworking people who understand this wound. I often say this in my wounds produce narratives. And so when people encounter this, what they perceive to be anger or hostility, and there's this misunderstanding, understand it comes from a very real place that if you don't educate yourself around, you'll never see and you'll never understand.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And I was so moved by your story. I was like, let me see if I can squeeze that in. So we have a question in the chat from one of our members, and where she mentions that she heard the term institutional courage this morning related to the Me Too movement. And I think I understand what that's connected to. Can you share what institutional courage might look like in an anti-racism work? So, what's your wisdom on this? How do we translate some of these things that we're seeing parallels across other topics?
So it's probably the best question I've ever gotten. I love that. And there are parallels here. In fact, when we talk about those echoes, the women's movement has always been tied to civil rights, going back to Civil War Reconstruction. Women don't get the right to vote by virtue of the 15th Amendment. It only enfranchises or says you can't discriminate based on race, color, doesn't extend that to women. And so you need a 19th Amendment, so on and so forth. So they've always been linked. But institutional courage, to answer the question more directly, would mean having the intestinal fortitude to stand up, to stand for something rather than to stand against it. And I want to be very clear what I mean by that. It's what King talked about in that piece that I played where he said, more people were responding to, in the way that I updated it, Derek Chauvin and police brutality rather than for equity. Institutional courage would mean we stand for equity, and these are the ways that we mean to pursue that, irrespective of or regardless of what's happening elsewhere. And we're going to stand on that and state that in a way that it makes it difficult for people to see us from that moment forward as anything other than an organization committed to equity, to justice, as opposed to what we have now, which is a lot of, and I don't want to, sometimes people get very upset with me for saying it this way, but I think it has to be said in this way, performative, which is, look at our range of equity work that we're doing across the organization, and these are the ways that we're committed, but it doesn't produce life. And there's no institutional fortitude behind that, because when the winds come, those programs disappear, those individuals in those positions are let go. You see those innovative programs called into question, and boards run and CEOs run, and human resources people start trying to read the tea leaves in terms of what's going to happen with the Supreme. Institutional fortitude says, this is who we are. We stay the course.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I think that is a very, very powerful final point to put on what I think has just been a dynamic conversation in dialogue, and very compelling. Just to wrap up, I just want to say we are so grateful for the opportunity to talk with you today, Dr. Williams, and really grateful for our partners at Delta Dental, whose great wisdom and idea and vision for this conversation series really helped to breathe life into this dialogue and this conversation today. Thank you, Dr. Williams, again for your time, for sharing your wisdom to benefit our coalition members, sponsors, stakeholders, and allies. We endeavor to bring content and forward that we think really resonates with where our organizations are. Some of them are different, spaces and phases on their journey towards their equity goals and commitments. And we're hoping that you found something in here that inspired you, that re-energized your efforts, help you think creatively about some of the challenges and the opportunities of progressing these movements forward. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, again, to those who took the time to jump on this call and to stay a little extra while we wrapped up. Thank you to Our sponsors to our executive committee. Our executive committee represents a number of WEIR member organizations, and we're so grateful to have their leadership and trust in this way. And we are also grateful for our member organizations who contribute to making this possible. Thank you so much again. We're going to wrap up for this time. Follow us on our newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn for more, and we'll see you the next conversation. Thank you so much and have a great day.